Hello and welcome to the WFDF Rules chat with myself, Hani Pendlebury, and the wonderful Rueben Berg. Wherever you're joining from around the world, it's great to have you with us. This will, of course, be rebroadcast later, so if you want to watch it back, brush up on your skills and your knowledge, we're going to be going through the rules of the WFDF rules, specifically of Ultimate Frisbee. Rueben, tell us a little bit about your role with the WFDF and why you're chatting to us today.
Yeah, sure. So I'm the chair of the WFDF Ultimate Rules Subcommittee. I've been the chair since, I think, 2009. So it's been a fair while now that I've been in that role. And I'm going to be heading over to the World Ultimate Club Championships as the head game advisor there. And just in the lead up to that event and the other important events we've got coming up, I thought it'd be great just to chat about the rules.
Yes, indeed. So we'll be covering a bit of the rules updates. So what are the newer rules that you might not be quite so au fait with? A little bit of USAU versus WFDF common errors for our North American cousins. What you might need to actually play these high-level events, why accreditation might be important and something you should consider, and a little bit of Q&A. We threw out some nets to see what questions we could get. We have maybe a couple of clips lined up, so that's what we'll be covering today. So let's crack straight on, Rueben, and a bit of introduction of why am I here. You might recognise my voice, maybe not quite so much the face. I'm a commentator for lots of Ultimate events and play as well. So I'll be playing for a change at WMUCC. And yeah, that will be fun. I really hate being streamed. Please, powers that be, don't put me on any streams playing because it's always uncomfortable on the other side. I have a lot of appreciation for people that have to be under those spotlights. So, Ruben, to get us going, what are the new rules that we should be aware of?
Yeah, so the new rules came in back in 2021. There wasn't too much substantial that people need to be aware of, but there are some significant changes. And first off, there's lots of other resources out there. You don't just have to rely on what I've got to say here today. There's lots of good resources. There's a track changes versions of these rules out there. There's also, if you really want to, I did an 1.5 hour plus video describing every single change, but I won't go to that level of detail here now this evening. I'll just highlight some of the most important ones. And I'm going to refer to my notes as we go through here. I don't remember all this stuff amazingly off the top of my head. But one of the rules changes was that we've introduced a new rule to say that if there was a deliberate or egregious breach of the rules, the captains can kind of discuss that and work out a way that they want to resolve that. The rules don't allow for what happens in those cases because the aim is that they're never going to do that. But if they do, we specifically got a rule now that enables captains to resolve that themselves, which I think is a useful addition. We've also then got a new change around what happens around offside. So it used to be that there was a repull and then there was this kind of reverse brick strange thing that happened. And we've got rid of that now. And basically, if you go offside when you're pulling, it's as if you did a bad pull and you treat it like a brick. So you don't get the advantage that you might have from having a good pull. And if you're offside on offense, then you're being absurd and you shouldn't do that. So I'm not even going to tell you what you should do in that instance. The other one there is around the continuation rule, which is something that's always a bit difficult for people to sometimes understand the complexities of. And it used to be that there were certain situations where the idea of continuation, where if it didn't affect, you should just let it stand. It didn't apply to some specific situations, but we just got rid of that. We just said now it applies to everything. So if there's ever something that happens where you just feel it didn't make a difference, you can allow the play to stand. There's no technicalities that get in your way there.
I like that.
The other one,
a good friction reducer.
Yeah. The other one that's fairly significant is around receiving rules, receiving fouls, and what happens after you get a block. And it's not so much a huge change to how the rules were actually played. It's just kind of clarifying and formalizing some stuff that was already kind of allowable within the rules, but wasn't quite clear. And so we've been more explicit about that. And so that's an important one to be mindful of. That also applies to offsetting fouls as well. There's an element of that applies around offsetting fouls. And I think we'll go through that in a bit detail a bit later, but that's another important one to be aware of. And the last two, the distance now between the thrower and the marker is another disc width back. And what it basically means is if you're marking, go further back. Pretty much, I guarantee you're too close. Move further back. There needs to be a line between your hands, can't come within a disc width of the torso of the thrower, which is a reasonable amount of distance. So that's an important shift. And the last one is we've adapted to the USAU rule around the kind of give-go, the quick give-go plays, that you can have a certain number of steps after you catch it, that you can release it without having to slow down. And so that's another important rule addition.
Excellent. Thanks for that recap. So going back a little bit to the introduction of the new rule where if there is a serious or an egregious breach. So could you give us an example of how, because obviously a lot of people perhaps watching this session will be the individuals nominated as the spirit captains. So for captains and spirit captains, how would you advise them to go about having those discussions if there are egregious or intentional breaches of the rules?
Yeah, I mean, it might help to kind of go with an example, might be useful. And one example could be if there's a receiver is about to make a catch in the end zone. It looks like they're pretty certainly going to make a catch. And then hopefully accidentally, the defender just comes and totally cleans them up, totally knocks them over. And so they didn't catch it. So it's not a strip, but they clearly would have caught it. It clearly would have been a goal. And under the current rules, where we're assuming that no one is breaking the rules on purpose, that would still be a receiving foul, but it wouldn't be a goal. You'd have to, after you check it in, move it up to the goal line. In that instance, I think it would be reasonable that the players could say, well, yeah, we're really sorry. That was clearly a bad foul on our behalf, even though it was accidental. We'll just let it be a goal. You don't have to go through that extra rigmarole. And so that's an instance where we don't want to have a rule to say you can do that, because the whole idea is you're not going to have those egregious breaches. But if we do, there's now a mechanism for captains to come together and work it out in a way that seems reasonable.
Gotcha. So you have the, I guess, moving away from the basketball style where if you get fouled on a, going for the hoop, you have your 2 shots at a free throw, but it makes it, bringing it back to the line, it makes it a bit more of a different scenario.
Yeah.
Brill. I have to ask you, Rueben, did the death of the clap spike occur in the latest rules update, or did I miss that on the previous update? Because I'm a real big fan of getting rid of the clap spike.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that the clap spike was never technically allowed anyway. But we have changed the definition of catch and the definition of possession, and that has made it clearer around a clap spike. So the idea.
So what are the definition of those two things for those that don't know?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Let me just bring it up in front of me here because it's quite important. I think an important thing for everybody is if you're ever trying to describe a rule or understand a rule better, the best way to do that is to actually look at the rule. That's the best way to go about that.
And tips and hints. There is a brilliant app you can get for your phone, your mobile phone device. If you have a smartphone, you can grab yourself the 2021 Rules app. It's very handy if you've left it late and not quite done your accreditation. It's obviously the accreditation is an open book exam, so you can have that alongside. And it's very neatly organized. Very good.
So a catch is defined within the rules as a non-spinning disc trapped between at least 2 body parts. So when you do that, like you actually pinch it, that's a catch. Possession is different though. Possession there's a few definitions of it, but the one that's important here is you establish possession when you catch a pass and then maintain that catch for more than one noticeable instant, and you maintain the catch throughout all ground contact related to the catch. So it's not enough to just clap it and then let go because you haven't demonstrated you had it for more than one noticeable instant, or you might not have survived ground contact either. So yes, it's very clear now at least that clap spiking is not allowed.
Perfect. So a little bit of a dig into the continuation rule, if we may, Rueben, because we have an example lined up of a pick continuation example from French nationals queued. But it's one of the things that really was highlighted. I had a little bit of a nosy through r/ultimate to see kind of, what people have asked previously, and continuation does seem to be a topic that comes up not infrequently. So we'll roll VT.
To haunt them. Udomfong. Just about squeezes that one around. Perus. Simon. Overthrown. I think there was a pick downfield.
So we only got one look at it, Rubes, but I'm sure you were paying acute attention wearing your game advisor hat. So what should happen in that scenario?
Yeah, well, there's two elements that are really important to understand there. The first off was the pick called before the disc was in the air? Like that's the fundamental thing that you need to understand. And from my quick looking at it, it seemed like the pick was called before the disc was in the air. And so that moves us into a different part of the rules. If it had been called while the disc was in the air, then you have to catch it. There's no excuse not to catch it. If you don't catch it and the pick was called while the disc was in the air, it's a turnover. There's no circumstances where it's not a turnover. It's always a turnover if the pick is called while the disc is in the air. Given that it was called, I believe, before the disc was in the air, now you enter into a different part of the rules and a different set of analysis. So the rules say that if it's called before it's in the air, then it's a stoppage and there shouldn't be a turnover unless there's this bit of a caveat, unless. And the way I like to think about this is that you should assume that it's not a turnover. Like the rules say it's not a turnover, you should stop playing. There's this unless though under 16.3 that says, if it turns out, though, that nobody heard the call who was involved in the incident, if the result would have been exactly the same had there been no pick and had there been no pick call, then the turnover should be allowed to stand. And so if it was the case that the receiver heard that there was a pick and knew that the catch he was trying to make was now irrelevant, then that did affect the play and the disc should go back. But that's something that what the defense needs to do is say, well, did the call affect the play? And you have to then just leave it up to that player to answer truthfully, yes or no. And that's how you resolve that.
Fab. So let's get another look at that one and see exactly what happened. And after your brilliant explanation there, Rubes.
To haunt them. Udom Fong. Just about squeezes that one around. Perus. Simon. Overthrown. To haunt them. Udom.
A bit of a double there at the end. So next week we've got lined up is our clip about a strip call, Ruben. So let's grab a little look at that one.
Is it? Who's going to be underneath that one? Powell reads it, but it's an error. Powell not able to collect ahead of Peter Blakely, but he's been caught on the head as Blakely tried to get that disc away from him.
Yeah, everything now becoming a real battle in this game. Powell going over the top, I believe, in that matchup. Got the height, but just, I think manages to almost smash himself on the shoulders of number 23 there.
It looked like
Blakely.
Looked like Powell had got the disc in his hand.
Listening back to some of my early days commentary there, Ruben. Not quite so confident on the microphone as I am these days.
That was good commentary.
I always cringe.
I was there for that one. That was a big point. And I've looked at that one a fair few times before, and it's not a straightforward one. I don't think. I think there's obviously if you dive and catch it and then you hit a legally positioned player and you hit their body and you drop it because you hit them and they had a legal right to be there, then that's not a strip. So that's a clear rule there that you can't just say that I bumped into you and therefore that makes it a foul. If that person was within the rules and where they were and you actually moved into them, then it wouldn't be a strip. The issue that I think is a bit tricky here is that Pete Blakely actually moves his hand up as it's happening. So it's unclear to me whether or not his arm moving up into where the offense's arm was is part of what caused the strip to actually happen. So to me, I think a really important thing to come back to you is there's a rule that says if it's not clear and obvious what happened in a play, then the disc should go back to the thrower. So I think that's probably the most applicable rule for that instance there.
Excellent. And if there had been a instance, if the disc had been caught and the player at the top, the Canadian, did actually land on the Australian counterpart, what would have been the situation there? Yeah,
then that would just be a turnover. That he lost possession due to contacting a legally positioned player, and so that's a turnover there.
Perfect. Yeah. All right. So moving us forward, we're going to have a little bit of a section on common differences between the USAU rule set and the WFDF rule set, Ruben. So take it away. What should our North American cousins watch out for?
Yeah, well, thankfully, not as much these days as it used to be. I've been doing a lot of hard work actually across a couple of years, the entire rules committee, as well as the USAU rules committee, and Jana in particular, the chair there. We've worked really closely to actually identify what all the different differences are and try and work out if there's no good reason, let's be the same. And so over the years, we've actually removed a lot of the significant ones. There are 3, I think, more significant ones that are still prevalent, and some of those are because there's a philosophical difference about how we go about officiating the game. One of those, obviously, is that in the USAU system, they have observers and they have actual powers to make calls within the game. They can call in and out calls actively during the game, and they also can resolve a foul call if they're asked by the players. They make a binding decision as part of that. Under the WFDF system, we definitely do not have that in place. We do have game advisors, but their role is to just provide advice. It's not binding advice, and it's up to the players to make every single call and resolve every single call in the WFDF system. So that's a really significant difference. And if you are used to playing in the USAU and having observers, you need to realize when you come over, and if you do have game advisors, it's quite different. It's not the same as that. So that's a significant difference. The other one is around the continuation rule we were just talking about before. And that whole idea of when was the pick called, that element is not the same within the USAU. So basically under the USAU system, if the thrower doesn't acknowledge that there was a call and throws it away, then it's a turnover, disregardless of when the call was actually made. So that's another significant difference, the way continuation works there. So basically under the USAU system, if there's a disc in the air, you've got to always try and catch it no matter what, because it could be a turnover, but that's not the case under WFDF. The other one is related to that other change I spoke about, and that's how receiving fouls are dealt with. We're getting much closer in the difference between USAU and WFDF in some of the changes we made around that receiving element that I spoke about before. And also the idea that under the USAU, they've kind of broadened what they mean by dangerous play to mean that many of the things that we would call a receiving foul, they would also call a foul, but under the dangerous play element. There is still a small category whereby if you're able to get a block and then you bump the body of your opponent and maybe knock them over, but you do so in a way that's not dangerous, under the WFDF system, that's a receiving foul. The block doesn't stand. Under the USAU system, it is a foul, but it's not a foul that changes possession. It just means you can stand up again and start playing defense. So that's a really significant difference to be aware of. It's not as significant as it used to be, though, but it is something to be mindful that there are differences. And a lot of times I see it's actually more a difference in interpretation than necessarily a difference in what the rule actually is, but it's an important thing to be aware of.
So I suppose now the adjustment with the WFDF rule set is that, oh goodness, I'm trying to think, it's the non-something level of contact. The word escapes me now, which is annoying because I was looking this up yesterday. There you go, non-minor contact. When non-minor contact occurs that's caused by both parties equally or deemed equally after the play has happened, that's then not going to change the outcome of the play itself, which is obviously a difference because it was that. As someone who's been playing a little bit of a while now, there's definitely that's been a crucial difference between the USAU and WFDF rule set. So what do you think of the recent updates, Rueben, is the most likely to trip up more experienced players?
Oh, that's a good question. What is the most likely to trip up people? Hopefully nothing, because they've all done their rules accreditation and what's my 1 3/4 hour video and know everything about it. What would I say? Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's probably actually the travel one. I think there's been a habit of people calling travels anytime they think someone isn't slowing down, and that's one of the ones that I saw, and people had a hard time adjusting to not having to automatically call travel every time you see someone, especially in a zone, taking a few steps then throwing it without slowing down. That's actually allowed now under the WFDF system. So that's an important one.
A bit of a clarification on that one, actually, with regards to being in the central zone or the end zone. If you are in sort of a give-go scenario where both players are continuing to make progress up the field, if that then is going over the goal line and becoming potentially a scoring pass, is that still permitted?
Yep, doesn't matter which pass it is. If it's the pass to make it into a goal, but you can't have gone into the end zone though. If that's what you're saying. If your steps have taken you into the end zone, you have to come back out of the end zone. Yeah.
Good. Just to put the little small point of clarification in on that one, because we've had some questions in the chat. We are watching the chat. Mr. Mike Palmer is like a hawk. He's relaying your questions to us. Do keep them coming. If there's anything you want us to clarify more or kind of go back to, please feel free. But obviously after this, I'm sure we'll get lots of comments and questions flowing in that we can attend to sort of in due course. So let's move on a little bit actually to those questions, Rueben, as I flick back to my notes that we prepared. So we've had some pre-questions. First off, for all of our Spirit captains out there who are maybe first-timers, what should be happening in pre-game Spirit circles?
Yeah, so, I mean, pre-game Spirit circles are something I'm seeing happening slightly more these days. They're not necessarily something that under the WFDF rules is there as a mandatory kind of thing, but I think it's a really useful way, especially at events like Worlds and Worlds events where you've got people from different countries coming together to play for the first time potentially. And what we know from looking what happens around the world, that there's different cultures that can develop in different countries about what level of contact might be acceptable, what ways of communicating might be acceptable, what's the normal within your ultimate community might be different from the normal from another country's ultimate community. And so I think those pre-game Spirit conversations are really important to have that kind of conversation about maybe what you've learned already from other teams that, well, we've realized that this is what our normal is and that's different from other teams. So have that conversation beforehand and say, well, if there's any concerns around that, come and have a chat during the game. Because it's always much better to have those conversations during the game than to wait afterwards and then complain about what some team did when they had no idea that you thought they were doing something wrong. So that's a really useful part of it.
Perfect. Any other sort of general communication tips of like how to approach an individual if there is an issue during a game and you want to kind of voice that? What if you were just a normal player? What would be your way of going about that, Rueben?
Yeah, I think it's really important you don't want to get the other person defensive straight away. You want to have them kind of open to the conversation. And so it might be a case of saying, well, I just wanted to share some of what we've experienced from our team. Is that okay if we can share that? And then you can say, well, from our side of things, we feel like this is happening. And allow that to be how you have the conversation rather than saying, why are you cheating? Like, that's not going to help. But our players are saying that it feels like this is happening, and then have a conversation around that.
Wicked. So in terms of other aspects of communication, there are more than just the players on the field. So although there is one that is player relevant, why is there no specific strip hand signal yet? That one comes from Liam Grant himself.
I'm sure. I'm happy to constantly get bombarded by that question. There's only a limited number of hand signals that we've got, and because we could come up with signals for all sorts of things. So there's got to be a line at some point where we say, well, these things do really warrant one, these things don't. Strip is right there on the edge of what might necessarily need one and what might not, but it's only really relevant whether it was a strip or not in very specific situations where it's in the end zone and you're not sure if the outcome of the discussion will be a goal or not, but you find that out when they signal goal afterwards. So keep harassing me, that's fine, I'll take it.
we'll get there. It's the kind of thing, isn't it, where people do this instead of a this. It's like they've almost created their own. So
if I go to clubs and I see every single player using the same signal to denote what they think a strip is, then it'll happen.
All right, there you go. People have power, even in the WFDF. Fabulous. So, what do all the whistles mean? As a game advisor, are you still in your fetching yellow shirts this season?
Yes. Green is now our more official shirt these days. But yes, I'll be there game advising at World Ultimate Club Championships, and we'll have game advisors at Masters as well and World Games. And it is something I think that it's really important if players are going across to those sorts of events to be aware that there's all these whistles going on, and not just when there's game advisors. There's timekeepers at every game. There's a really useful document you can find on the WFDF website that's called the Championship Timings, and it shows you what all the whistles mean. But basically, as a general rule, one whistle will mean offense. You're going to have to get ready to do whatever you're supposed to be doing very soon. 2 whistles means offense. You're supposed to be ready for that thing that you were getting ready for. And 3 whistles means defense. Now you're supposed to have done the thing you're supposed to have So that's what the whistles mean. But it's just sometimes people freak out when they hear the whistles and rush. There's still a fair amount of time, and most of it's around getting ready for the pool. But you can, if you know what they mean and what they signify, it makes it easier to manage them.
Absolutely. Because if you've not studied what the whistles actually mean, as you say, it does sort of create a sense of, oh goodness, there's people watching and observing this thing and making us keep to time. Brilliant. So in terms of other questions we've been asked, if you have a player on your team who's being particularly adamant about a call, and perhaps their teammates and the opposition are kind of have a contrary view, is there any way that can be overruled by the captains, or is it always going to kind of come back to, so for example, if it is perhaps a strip call where the player is quite adamant that they did have possession, obviously you do have the ability to send that one back, but in a situation where the kind of player has to make the call themselves, if maybe there isn't a game advisor on hand to give an extra pair of eyes, how would you go about resolving that? Yeah,
so there's nothing in the rules that will ever say that a player can't make the call they want to make. They're always going to be entitled to make whatever call they think is the right call. However, as you said, if there's game advisors, they can provide advice. But there is a specific rule that says that if there's a team captain or a spirit captain or a coach who's on the sideline, they can actually come onto the field during a stoppage if they think their player is clearly making the wrong call. And they can do that without being asked. And they can come onto the field to encourage their player on their own team to change their call, but only if it's to the detriment of their team. To say, well, you're calling strip, but I don't think that it was a strip, so I think that you should retract that call. I can't make them do it, but you can go on there and have that conversation. And ultimately, what you can also do is you could call a spirit of the game stoppage to try and have a conversation around it, because there might be some other underlying issues around it that need to be discussed, and that's okay. You can have a spirit of the game stoppage to do that. But those are, I think, the two best mechanisms that in the rules to be able to do that.
Perfect. And a little bit actually of brushing up in terms of one of the lesser called things is which is spirit of the game stoppage, spirit of the game timeouts, perhaps. What kind of situations would you expect those to happen?
Yeah, I think there's sometimes a bit of a reluctance from teams to call spirit of the game stoppages because they feel like it's a disaster if you have to call one. And I often try and encourage teams to think about, well, they're actually really useful tools to make sure something disastrous doesn't happen. And so if you get to a point where there is a bit of chippiness in the game, where there's been a few calls that are kind of tit for tat kind of calls, like if you want to try and put a stop to that, it can be hard to, like, in between points in the huddles, like, oh, I just remember we should probably not do that. Even if the spirit captains have had a chat about it and you're trying to share it, it's actually really useful to say, well, let's just call a spirit stoppage so we can bring our teams together and say, hey, we've realized that the game has started off a little bit chippy. Let's put that aside. Let's go out there and play fresh and have a great game. That's a really powerful thing to be able to do it. It doesn't signify that the game has deteriorated. It just means you've identified something you want to work on, and you can have that stoppage to take the time to work it out.
Brilliant. We love that kind of communication and nipping the problems in the bud before we get ones that we look back on through sort of gritted teeth, regardless of which side you're on, because it really sort of does ruin the atmosphere when those issues are allowed to grow and prosper.
And the reason it's called a spirit of the game stoppage is because it will stop the clock. So you don't have to worry about going over time because of it. It'll stop the clock, and the clock will restart after the end of the spirit of the game stoppage. So that's an important distinction to be made.
Indeed, causing nightmare for the schedulers and the people trying to keep the tournament running, the tournament organising committees and directors. But we do it because it's important. On that one, actually, while I look at my notes, Rueben, a really easy question that's going to really rile up some of the LTTV crew, I'm sure. Are you a fan of the countdown clock or the count up clock when it comes to broadcasting games?
To watching games? Yeah, okay. I think both are useful. What I think is the most important thing is to have a target, what the points target is on the screen. I think that's even more important than what the clock is. And to say it's game to 15, and if it's changed and now it's a game to 13, make sure it says game to 13 so people know what's actually happening. That's, I think, more important than what the clock is. Does that bypass your question?
That does bypass the question elegantly. Well done, Rueben. Avoider of all controversy. So another question we have was, in a scenario where a player walks up to the disc, goes to pick it up, and then walks off, Is that an infraction, a violation, or perfectly acceptable within the current rule set?
It depends. There's a few elements there. So the offense does have a responsibility that someone on the team is walking towards the disc after a turnover to go and pick it up. There's also the time limits that are in play depending on where the disc is. If it's in the central zone, there's 10 seconds. If it's in the end zone or out of bounds, it's 20 seconds. But regardless of that, someone has to be walking towards it. So if one player is walking towards it and they decide not to pick it up and they just walk away after they've kind of walked towards it, then that is a violation, unless someone else on their team was also walking towards it and they've kind of called them off. You know, those instances where someone will be going to pick it up and another person is walking towards it. So no, I'll get it. They can walk away. That's fine because someone was walking towards it. But someone on offense has to be walking towards it. They can change to running towards it, but moving towards it the whole time.
Perfect. It's a very good explanation of that one. I personally have seen that happen quite a few times this season, and it gets my goat a little bit. But this is not about me learning about the rules from you necessarily and getting all my stuff done. So in terms of poaching defenders, sort of around the stack and dangerous plays, can we get a sort of a clarification on ways to address those and assess those? Because obviously, I mean, the classic one is a defender poaching off the front of stack, upline cut, coming in from behind. So those sorts of scenarios, how would you advise players to go about discussing those calls?
Yeah, look, those are really tricky ones, and it's something I'm always mindful of. That's one of the areas where there can often be some of the most dangerous things happening, where people are doing kind of fairly normal ultimate things, but there's still an opportunity for something quite dangerous to happen. There's a few important elements of the rules to be mindful of there, and this is mostly all detailed in section 12 of the rules. And one of those is that every player is entitled to any position they want on the field, as long as they don't initiate contact in doing so, but also as long as they're not moving in a reckless or dangerously aggressive manner. So running full speed into a space where you've got no idea what else is in there, you've never checked, you've never looked, you're not paying attention to what's in front of you, that's reckless. You shouldn't be doing that. Even if you feel like you've got the right to get the disc, it's not acceptable to just run headlong into a space without knowing what's actually in there. So that's one element. The other element is that when we talk about who initiated contact, there's some quite clear descriptions about what that means now within the rules under 12.7. And so that the person who initiates the contact is either the person who arrived at the point of contact after the opponent had already established a legitimate position there, either their stationary or moving position, so they had that right to that space. Or you could also initiate it by adjusting your movements in a way that created unavoidable contact, so that no one could have possibly avoided you even if they'd known that you were going to be there. So you have to think about those different aspects of, was either of the people moving in a reckless manner by not watching where they were going? Is that what made the foul occur? And who actually got there first does matter, unless you got there in a way that the other person couldn't possibly avoid. So those are the different elements to be mindful of. There's also another important clarification in there in the rules under 12.6, that if you're not actually reasonably certain that you're going to be able to get the block legally without initiating contact with another player who's also moving legally, then you should just not go for it. And you don't get to call some magical play and get the disc back. You just don't go for it, because by doing so, you would have caused contact. And so the onus is on the player also to remove themselves. Now, if you think that the other player is actually moving illegally, and that's why you would get contacted, then you can pull up and call dangerous play and resolve it that way. But if the other person's moving in a legal way and you think, oh, I could get there, but we're going to collide, then don't go there. Pull out, let the person moving legally get the disc.
Yeah, don't go there, Simba. It's not the place for you. Excellent. So next question we have, if a receiver makes a catch outside of the end zone, say they're maybe 2 meters short, but they celebrate the goal and in so doing put the disc on the floor, is that a turnover?
No, in most cases that would not be a turnover. This is based on the premise that we're all officials. When you're playing on the field, you're an official, you're an umpire, right? And so if you think it's a goal and you've signaled it's a goal, then that's a stoppage. Play stops. And so there's a caveat within the rules, within the annotations, that says if there was if there was a reasonable grounds for you to think that it was a goal and you've called goal, then that's a stoppage. And even if you'd thrown it and turned it over or spiked it, well, if you spiked it, maybe you should leave anyway. But if you've done something else to celebrate, then you get the disc back even though you weren't in the end zone. If there was no reasonable reason, like if it was at midfield or something and that you were just being silly, then it would be a turnover. But if there's reasonable grounds to think that you might have thought you were in the end zone and you've called a stoppage by either saying goal or doing an action that indicates goal, then that's a stoppage and no turnover is possible.
So in regards to travels and acceptable travels versus non-acceptable travels, players that are perhaps a little bit of a wanderer when they have the disc, before they've released it, what would be your kind of guidance on what would be acceptable to make a travel call on if the player has the disc in hand and is just doing that kind of like back and forth, which we see a lot of perhaps less experienced players do, but it happens to all of us.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it is a travel. That you can't do that. So you're within your rights to call the travel. If they've done it for a little bit and then they've thrown, and the throw that they've done is independent of any of that other travelling, then you probably shouldn't call it on the throw. You should call it at the time you see it happening, not wait for them to throw and then think you get a free travel call on it. So that's an important distinction to make. The other option could be, if you don't think it's actually affecting anything, to at least talk to the person in between points, talk to the spirit captain and say, we notice this person is not keeping their pivot point as they're supposed to. So can we just remind them to make sure they keep that? Because it is part of it also is that the thrower has a responsibility always to be trying to follow the rules. And they might be getting some advantage by not having to think about what the rules are and just move their feet willy-nilly.
In fact, we actually have a bit of a VT clip lined up about a travel example video. So we will go have a look at that now.
Underneath, Juan Morri. Roger, oh, little upside down, quick flip to his brother Axel. And I think this is going to go back on the travel.
So to you, Rueben, does that look like a valid movement there?
From just that brief little look at it, I would say that it looked like they were maintaining their direction. They only changed direction after they'd got rid of the disc, from my looking at that initially there. But it's always, unless you've got the right angle of watching down the line of where they're running, it can be hard to know. But just from that brief look at it, it looked like they released it before they had 3 points of contact, and they released it while they were still moving in a straight line, and then they changed direction. Tricky one.
Perfect. Oh, yeah. Well, this is the interesting thing, isn't it? Is that these, should we say, moments where we don't often have the ability to watch it back in slow-mo, replay it over and over again ad infinitum. So when that opportunity does exist, and it is a game that's being filmed, whether that's a live stream or perhaps, a coach on the sideline with the camera, how do players incorporate media, camera, video footage into helping assist with calls?
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely provision in the rules to allow players to refer to technology, whether it's a photograph or a video. I remember back in 2006, I used a photograph to call myself in back in the National Ultimate Frisbee League with a pass from Jonathan Potts. So I did that a long time ago, and I think it's a really important, a valuable tool to be able to do. So players can refer to that. And you can also get support from other players on the sideline who aren't playing. They can also watch and provide you advice around that. There's a caveat again around that, though, in that you shouldn't be going and telling someone on the field who's an opponent, basically, that their call is wrong because of something you've seen on the video. That's seen as not an appropriate way to use technology. If it's so clear, get someone else to watch it or get that person to come and watch it. But yeah, don't do it the other way around where you're going and telling someone they're wrong because of what you've seen on a video that they haven't a chance to see.
Is there a corresponding hand signal that can be used perhaps to kind of indicate that someone has a good perspective?
Yeah, I mean, lots of teams have their own different methods for indicating that they have good perspective. Just putting your hand up is a useful one that people know to call on you for some information. But yeah, again, if I see the same thing being used universally across every single game that I partake in, it might become an official rule. But definitely please do make use of the video footage if it's there. It can be really useful, but there's also a caveat to not delay the game unnecessarily to go and do that. If you're having to watch 10 different slow-mos, then it's not clear and obvious, and send it back.
I have to say, massive shout out to all of our media crews of various different organisations who really do have an amazing ability to reel up those slow-mos and replays within sort of seconds of interesting things happening on the pitch. Although I definitely have very fond memories, Rueben, I don't know if you have, of the Jumbotron at the World Championships back in Ohio in 2018 and watching the whole spectator crowd, all of the players on the pitch watching the replays on the massive big screens right in front of them. That was definitely entertaining as well as educational.
For sure.
So we have another clip about some might consider a manufactured pick. So we'll have a little look at that one.
Ooh. Kudu getting the disc, but it floated just for a little bit as Weightless thought they could sniff it out. Kudu throwing it across the field. Sharma there, but it's coming back because it's a pick call.
Oh. He's got quite, I'm not sure if it was an aggressive celebration or if he was just a little bit upset that the disc is actually coming back.
That's a curious one there. I suppose, Rueben, for those that maybe didn't quite catch it, that would be, I guess, a pick off the front of the stack where the player's clearing through and the front of stack then is sort of in the way of the trailing defender. What would be your take on that one?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I'd probably have to watch it a few more times to wrap my head around exactly what was going on there. But I think importantly, within the rules, when we talk about picks, you should never be trying to have picks happen on purpose. There's a specific rule around that within there, and it is that all players should take reasonable efforts to avoid the occurrence of picks. So you can't think you've got some amazing new strategy of creating intentional picks everywhere. You've got to try and avoid picks. And one of the ways we've helped to do that too is if there is a stoppage and you're already in a situation that you think will be a pick, you can actually move during a stoppage with the agreement with both players so that you avoid the pick happening straight after the disc is checked back in. So, but definitely don't have intentional picks. It's not within the rules.
Indeed, playing different sports here. You might be allowed in other places, but it's not allowed on an ultimate field. So regarding the pre-stall and state of play, section 8.5 and beyond, this person is clearly a rules nut. They've named the section we're talking about as well. If it hasn't quite been 10 seconds, but a player is standing over the disc waiting for the rest of their team to set up, is it appropriate to issue delay of game warning and then to start the stall count? Also, if it's been longer than 10 seconds, but you haven't done a pre-stall, can you start the pre-stall straight away if they're taking a long time to walk to the disc?
Yeah. So this can cause some confusion sometimes, and understandably, because it's not a rule that everyone necessarily uses all the time. It is within the main rule set now. It used to just be in the appendix. It's now part of all the rules. And I think the thing I really want to stress about this is the aim of this rule is not that every time there's a turnover, people start counting down 10 seconds or 20 seconds and force people to start stalling before someone's ready. Like, that's not what we're trying to do. You need to kind of think about what the approach here is. And the idea is that we often see the case where the thrower will make a big huck and will go all the way down the other field to be a turnover. And the person who was marking that thrower decides that they're going to be the ones who are going to pick up the disc. And so they're going to wander the 70 meters from one end of the field to the other to go and pick up the disc. And because someone's moving at walking pace or faster to get to the disc, it's not necessarily against the rules, but that just means that those of us who are watching have to sit and watch two people just have a stroll from one end of the field to the other. That's what this rule is trying to avoid, that there's actually some impetus, so the offense has to try and get play starting quicker. And that's really what the rule's about. So what I suggest in most of these cases is just use the delay of game call to remind the offense they have that responsibility to take that, use only the 10 seconds or the 20 seconds. So that's one part of it. You can call the countdowns, you can call the 10, the 5, and then you can start the stall out. But that's only there to really give that extra incentive so the offense really does follow. Having said that, with all the 10 seconds, I think part of the question there was if they're just standing over it and it's still within the 10 seconds, then you don't have to pre-stall. You can just say delay of game, and that should prompt them to actually pick up the disc and start playing, because you can't just stand over it. That's against the rules. And if they don't, then you can call a violation. And what that means is it will be a stoppage. And often the reason why they were standing over it is to wait for their players to get in a better position so they can pick it up to throw. And so by calling a violation, that means everyone has to freeze, and you're going to check it in off a stop disc. So that kind of negates that advantage they were trying to get by delaying the check. But ultimately, I would encourage people to not necessarily always count down. But if you do want to start stalling them, you do need to count down if it's related to the 10 and 20 seconds. You can start stalling them if it's related to just standing over the disc, regardless of the time. That's complicated. Yeah. Read the rule, but think more about the principle. If you're on offense, try and hurry up. If you're in defense, you can remind them to hurry up.
Excellent. So we've had, I think, what might be a quick win. Is it necessary to call stall after stalling somebody to 10?
No. Do you have to actually say stall? Is that the question?
Mm-hmm.
So you have to say the T of 10 for it to actually be a stall out. I'm going to have to look at this. It's not as quick as you thought it was there, is it? If you actually look at the rule...
Supplementary question, do you also have to say stalling at the beginning of your stall count? And does that affect when the stall out technically occurs?
You have to say stalling at the start of your stall count, but you don't need to leave a gap between stalling and 1. So you can say stalling 1, 2, 3. But if it gets to 10, and the reason you're contesting is because they didn't say stalling, that doesn't apply. You can only object to that at the start of the stall count. Once you get to the end, you can only say, well, your last couple of counts were fast. You can't revert back to something happened before, because once you've let it go, then you've accepted that call. So that's those various elements of it. If you actually
that would be the rule where it's you have to call the infraction when you observe it. You cannot hold on to it for a little bit in the back pocket for later.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So there is a name for the turnover, which is stall out. And yes, I think you do need to call it, because you could say 10, and that's not clear, though, whether or not you think it's a stall out, because you could have counted to 10, but you think they got it off beforehand. To actually indicate you think it's a stall out, you should say stall out.
Well, it's good communication if you say exactly what it is that's happening as well. Brilliant. So a couple more technical ones, and we get some broader questions going, because we've got about 10 minutes left. So if you have any burning questions, please put them in the chat so you can make us suitably aware that you want to know some more. In a situation where you're not playing zone defense and a thrower, basically a defender coming in for whatever purpose, we'll say, gets a block, say about, maybe half a meter away from the thrower, and the thrower then calls double team. First of all, is that a stoppage of play? Because obviously it's been a turnover, and then secondary, is that kind of talk us through how the legality of that works in terms of calling a double team, but also having released the disc.
Sure. There's a rule that I wrote that perfectly covers this situation. It's 18.1.6, and it says if a marking infraction or marking violation is called when the thrower also attempts a pass before, during, or after the call has no consequences. And if the pass is incomplete, then the turnover stands. So you can't get a double team back because someone was there and you threw it to them. I will say unless, because there is an unless that applies to this, and that goes to one of the first things we spoke about, and that is if the person who got the block was just trying to mark you, was just basically a second marker, and therefore they were cheating, that was an egregious breach of the rules, you could go back to that caveat of, well, this person is deliberately breaking the rules, so the captains could resolve that in a way that's not in accordance with the rules. They could say, well, yep, we agree that player was deliberately breaking the rules, trying to get the block, and so the turnover won't stand. So I hope that helps.
That does indeed help. I think, well, certainly from my perspective, that was quite clear. If you disagree, please do let us know, I'll say in the chat. So in terms of more looking at the macro level of the rules, sort of defining a certain maybe tournaments policy, whether that's kind of, because there are some, obviously, in terms of formats, etc., there are some flexibilities offered to tournament organising committees. is there any mechanism by which the players can actually overrule sort of those sorts of principles and those rules that are put in place that are maybe more tournament specific?
I mean, tournaments are able to put in different rules if they would like. You can have variations to the rules if that's what a tournament would like to do. It's not something that would happen at a WF kind of setting, but I think there's often this kind of perception of the kind of captain's clause that captains can come up with whatever rules they want to. That's not something that exists within the WFDF system. You've got to follow the rules that are the rules of ultimate, and it's only when people have breached it that you can come up with your own alternative. But I would think that in general for tournaments you should just be following whatever the WFDF rule is. But specific events could choose to want to trial. I've seen places where they've trialed different rules. You might want to experiment with some rules at a specific event, and I think that's a useful thing to be able to do. But yeah, you just want to make sure that everyone is aware of that, because the assumption is that you're playing under the standard rules if you're playing somewhere.
Perfect. And so on that sort of note of differences and trialing different rules, what was the kind of, because obviously so for example, the European Federation, in line with the World Games sort of, gendered pulling ratio rules, they implemented that across the board in all of their events sort of ASAP. So talk us through a little bit of, obviously, that's the decision that was made by the Rules Committee to not incorporate that in all of the WFDF events at large, because obviously it's a relatively new thing and sort of untested. But what was the kind of decision making around not including that in all of the mainstream events this season?
Yeah, well, it's a relatively large change and it's untested. Those things you just said. I think it's a really good idea, and I think there are things to be think about what it means at different levels of play. I think that it will have potentially a different impact on the game at different levels of play. And at the World Games, I had no doubt that it's a great thing to be able to do. I think it's very likely that at something like World Clubs and World Masters, it's a really good thing to be able to do. But we wanted to see what it looked like, and it's actually been really useful to be able to watch other events doing it. The other part of it too, though, is that we like to make sure that there's time for teams to get ready for these sorts of things. And we try not to have any adjustments to the rules within a year of the actual event. That's ideal. And so for us, it was a bit too close to those events to say we're going to make this significant change, because it might change who you select on your team based on that rule change. And so it didn't seem fair to make it as close as it was to those events. But hopefully, based on what I've seen, it looks like it's going really well. I'll see it in person at World Games, and I'm hopeful that it does roll out across other events, but we'll see where that threshold is of where we think that rule is most appropriate.
Brilliant. So we've had a request for a bit of a clarification about the double team rules when it comes to specifically and explicitly in zone situations where there's a crashing offensive player that comes through the cup and the defender obviously then crashes in with them. You might use a different term, whatever Frisbee culture you're from, but the idea of that mechanism of them being able to come in and mark the individual that's now in front of the disc or close to. So can you just clarify for us a little bit in terms of how the double team rule works in that instance, how quickly that defender might need to move out of the space again, etc.?
Yep. Yeah, so this was a change a couple of years back. I think it's about 5 years back we adjusted the language here, in that if you are coming to that space of the 3 meters of the thrower, you have to either be running through it, and that's fine, but that's not what we're talking about here, or you have to be guarding another player. And so that means to guard someone, you have to be within 3 meters of that other player, and you have to be reacting to their movements. And so that's the important element of it. You can't be reacting to the thrower and simultaneously reacting to the other player. There's probably some scenario where you might be able to, but you have to be making sure if you're within that space, you're reacting to the other opponent who's not the thrower, who's within the 3 meters of you. And that's your requirement, to be actually reacting to that other player. And if all you're doing is saying, oh, there's someone nearby me, I know they're kind of roughly over there, but now that means I can only focus on the thrower, then you are in a double team. You have to know where that other player is and be reacting to their movements. That doesn't mean you can't wave your hand and maybe block the throw at the same time, but you have to be reacting. You have to be guarding, which means reacting and within 3 meters of that other player.
Brilliant. So we are slowly running out of time here. So we're going to close the general question floor for now. As I say, if you do have any further rules questions for us, if you want us to have another session ahead of the event that you'll be playing later on this season, please do let us know. We're more than happy to jump on and help you guys out with your rules knowledge, because obviously it's such an important part of any self-officiated sport. But just to kind of close this up, Rueben, so general advice on being as spirited as you possibly can be. What does it mean in kind of, I mean, obviously everyone has their own different view on these things, but what are the principles to really focus on to be well-spirited when playing Ultimate?
Yeah, I think one part of it is before you get there, you need to try and learn the rules as best as you can to actually understand what the rules are. That's an important part of being spirited. And then when you're there playing the game, I think the fundamental part is to not assume that the other player is deliberately cheating, to not assume the other player is lying, is making it up, to come into that conversation recognizing that we are all, as people, not great at knowing exactly what happened in a situation. We're not robots who can perfectly wind it back and know what happened. We all have a different perception of what happened. And just because someone's perspective is different from yours doesn't mean that they're deliberately cheating. And making sure you're coming with that mindset of they might be right, I might be right, or maybe it's something in between, but not assuming that you're always going to be right when you come into that conversation, and actually listening to what the other people are saying, to not just your opponent, but what other teammates are saying, other people around, to be really actually able to listen and take a breath and then decide what you think is the right call based on that. I think that's really important.
I really like the framework of talking about sort of objective truth. If you've got what one party thinks happened, what the other party thinks happened, and then what actually happened. There's three separate sort of narratives to be sort of explored and explained. But that's brilliant. And last but by no means least, any sort of tips again for those that are taking on the Spirit captaincy responsibilities in the upcoming events? What are your final words to those folks?
Yeah, I think one of the most important roles of Spirit captains is talk to the other team's Spirit captain, have a conversation, have a dialogue, have a constant checking in with the other Spirit captain, and then also make sure that you're relaying to your team important things they need to know. It's no good if you realize that someone is doing the wrong thing on your team or their team. If you don't actually communicate it and say, we've realized this and we need to work on this, make sure you communicate that. So that's really important.
Fab. And my final question to you, Rueben, is what's your favorite rule?
What is my favorite rule? There's a lot of good rules out there. I would say that my favorite rule, I'm going to find it for you here. It is 1.10.1. And that is if a player who is not directly involved believes that a teammate has made an incorrect call or caused a foul or violation, they should inform their teammate. This idea that you have a responsibility, even if it's against your interest of your team, to go and actually say, actually, I think it was a foul. That's a really powerful rule, and one I think that more and more people should use.
Definitely. And in the Spirit scoring assistance, the guidance that comes along with applying Spirit scores to matches, that's actually explicitly stated, doesn't it? In that, one of the examples was their teammates informed them of, incorrect or egregious calls, sort of things. Brilliant. Well, thanks ever so much for your time this evening, Rueben. It's been a pleasure to see you virtually. I look forward to seeing you in the flesh at an event very soon. As I say, if you have any more questions for Rueben, if you want us to do this again at some point in the near future, please do let us know. But it's been a pleasure to have you along with us, and we'll see you at an event very soon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Alti.tv